The concert hall fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the suffocating quiet of collective shock. 300 of Chicago's wealthiest citizens sat frozen in their velvet seats, their champagne glasses suspended mid-air, their conversations dying on their lips. At the center of the stage, under the harsh spotlight, sat a man whose scarred, weathered hands hovered over the keys of a $2 million Steinway grand piano. His clothes were torn and stained. His face carried the deep lines of 1,000 sleepless nights. And standing just off stage, a silver-haired billionaire named Robert Sterling wore an expression caught between amusement and contempt, certain he was about to witness the humiliation he'd orchestrated. But what happened next would shatter every assumption in that room about worth talent and what it means to be human. To understand this moment, we need to go back 2 hours. Back to when James Crawford stood outside the Millennium Concert Hall, his worn jacket pulled tight against the November wind, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing Chicago air. The building before him gleamed with warmth and light. Through the tall windows, he could see men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns laughing and mingling beneath crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than he'd earned in his entire life. A banner stretched across the entrance read, "Annual Charity Gala for Wounded Veterans." The irony wasn't lost on James. He was a wounded veteran, but he knew he wasn't the kind they wanted to see tonight. They wanted heroes with medals and inspiring stories, not men like him, men who'd come home broken and never quite managed to put the pieces back together. His hands, scarred and stiff from the cold, trembled as he shoved them deeper into his pockets. Those hands had once been called gifted miraculous even. At 16, James Crawford had been the youngest piano prodigy ever accepted to Juilliard on full scholarship. Critics had written that his interpretation of Rachmaninoff moved audiences to tears, that his technique was flawless, that he had the touch of an artist 3 times his age. That was 13 years ago. Before the army. Before Afghanistan. Before the explosion that shredded his right hand and sent fragments of metal through his left. Before the doctors told him he'd never play again, that he should be grateful just to have basic motor function. Before the nightmares, the PTSD, the depression that swallowed him whole. Before he lost his apartment, his dignity, and finally, his family. For 5 years, James had lived on Chicago's streets, moving from shelter to shelter, sometimes sleeping in subway stations when the shelters were full. He'd avoided his old neighborhood, terrified of running into someone who'd known him before someone who'd remember the prodigy and see what he'd become. Most of all, he'd avoided his younger sister, Sarah, the one person who'd never given up looking for him. Sarah Crawford was inside that building right now. James knew because he'd seen her name on the volunteer list posted by the entrance. She was a nurse now, volunteering at the gala, just as she volunteered everywhere, always trying to help, always looking for her lost brother in every homeless veteran's face. James had come here tonight, not to go in, but to see her from afar, just to know she was okay. Their mother had died 6 years ago, right after James enlisted. She'd never known what happened to him in the war, never seen him come home in pieces. Sometimes James thought that was a blessing. Inside the hall, Robert Sterling held court near the piano, surrounded by admirers and sycophants. Sterling owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Chicago and never let anyone forget it. He was the gala's primary sponsor, and he made sure everyone knew his donation of $1 million was the largest contribution of the evening. Sterling was holding forth about his latest acquisition, a collection of rare instruments, including the Steinway Concert Grand that now graced the stage. The piano alone had cost $2.3 million, he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. He called it an investment in culture, though everyone knew it was really an investment in his own ego. A woman in a silver gown asked if he played. Sterling laughed a sharp bark of sound that carried across the room. Only maestros and prodigies deserve to touch an instrument like this, he'd said. It would be an insult to the craftsmanship for ordinary fingers to sully its keys. Outside, James turned to leave. He'd seen enough. Sarah looked well, healthy and strong, and that was all he needed to know. It was time to find a warm grate for the night, maybe the one behind the diner on 5th Street, where the owner sometimes left out day-old bread. But as he walked away, the sky opened up. Chicago rain in November is a special kind of misery cold enough to chill your bones, but not quite cold enough to turn to snow. Within seconds, James was soaked through. His thin jacket offered no protection. Water poured down his face, his neck soaking into his already damp clothes. He looked back at the concert hall. The lobby had a small entrance alcove, just a few feet of shelter. He could stand there until the worst of the storm passed. It wouldn't hurt anyone. He'd be invisible, just another shadow in the doorway. James hurried back and pressed himself into the corner of the alcove, trying to take up as little space as possible. Through the glass doors, he could see the warmth and light he'd left behind. A young couple walked past him into the building without a glance. An older man in a tuxedo looked directly at him, frowned, and hurried inside faster. James closed his eyes. This was a mistake. He should brave the rain, find somewhere else. But his body was so tired, so cold. Just a few minutes, he told himself. Just until the rain lets up. The doors burst open and a security guard stepped out, his hand already moving toward his radio. "Hey, you can't stay here. This is a private event. Move along." James raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not causing trouble, just waiting for the rain to stop." The guard's expression hardened. "I don't care if it's raining sideways, you need to go. Now." James nodded and stepped back into the rain. The cold hit him like a physical blow. He hunched his shoulders and started walking, not sure where he was going, just knowing he needed to get away before the guard decided to call the police. A night in jail for trespassing was the last thing he needed. Behind him, the door opened again. James didn't turn around. He kept walking head down against the rain. "Wait." The voice was female, tentative. "Excuse me, wait." James froze. He knew that voice. It had changed, deepened slightly with age, but he'd know it anywhere. It was the voice that used to call him to dinner, that used to cheer at his recitals, that used to whisper goodnight through their shared bedroom wall when they were kids. Sarah. He stood with his back to her, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run. She couldn't see him like this. She couldn't know what he'd become. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" Sarah's footsteps came closer. "The gala has resources for veterans. If you're hungry or need a place to stay tonight, I can help connect you with services." James started walking faster. His vision blurred, and not just from the rain. After 5 years of imagining this moment, dreaming of reunion, here it was, and all he could do was run. Because Sarah deserved better than this. She deserved a brother she could be proud of, not a broken man who couldn't even keep a roof over his head. "Wait, please. I just want to help." Sarah's voice carried a note of desperation now. "My brother, he was a veteran too. He's been missing for years. Every time I see someone who might need help, I think maybe someone somewhere is helping him." James stopped. The words hit him harder than any explosion in Afghanistan. She was still looking for him. After everything, after years of silence, she hadn't given up. He turned slightly, just enough for her to see his profile, then caught himself and turned away again. He mumbled something incoherent and hurried around the corner, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway with rain soaking her elegant dress, staring after him with a confused expression on her face. There was something about him, she thought. Something familiar in the way he held his shoulders, the shape of his silhouette. But it couldn't be. James wouldn't run from her. If James were alive, if he were here, he'd call her name. He'd come home. Sarah shook her head and went back inside, trying to ignore the strange ache in her chest. The feeling that she'd just let something important slip through her fingers. Inside the hall, Robert Sterling's voice rose above the string quartet playing in the corner. He'd had several glasses of champagne, and his natural arrogance had blossomed into full pomposity. He stood beside the Steinway, one hand resting possessively on its polished surface. A board member named Patricia Chen suggested that perhaps someone should play the beautiful instrument. Sterling laughed. "This piano is a work of art, Patricia. It deserves an artist. I wouldn't dare insult it with my amateur plunking, and I certainly wouldn't let just anyone touch it. So it just sits there looking pretty," someone else asked. "Seems like a waste?" "Not at all," Sterling replied. "Its presence elevates the entire event. Beauty doesn't always need to be functional. Sometimes it simply needs to exist as a reminder of excellence of standards. In a world where everyone gets a participation trophy, where mediocrity is celebrated as good enough, we need symbols of true quality. This piano represents the best of human craftsmanship. Only the best musicians should ever touch it." He gestured expansively, warming to his theme. "When I was acquiring this instrument, the dealer told me it had been played by Vladimir Horowitz himself. Can you imagine the greatest pianist of the 20th century touching these very keys? That's the level of talent this instrument demands. That's the standard." The people around him nodded and murmured agreement, though several looked uncomfortable with his increasingly elitist rhetoric. But Sterling didn't notice. He was on a roll now, holding court, feeding off the attention. "You know what the problem is today?" he continued. "Everyone thinks they're special. Everyone thinks they deserve a chance, regardless of whether they've earned it. We've lost the understanding that some things, some opportunities should be reserved for those who've proven themselves worthy. Excellence isn't democratic. It's hierarchical. It requires discrimination in the truest sense of the word, the ability to discriminate between the mediocre and the magnificent." Outside, James huddled in a recessed doorway, 3 buildings down from the concert hall. The rain showed no sign of stopping. He was shivering uncontrollably, now his teeth chattering so hard, his jaw ached. Hypothermia was a real risk. He'd seen men die from exposure on nights less cold than this. He had to get inside somewhere. Anywhere. The concert hall was out of the question now that Sarah had seen him, even if she hadn't recognized him. But maybe he could slip into the lobby of one of the other buildings just long enough to dry off and warm up. James stood and immediately stumbled. His legs weren't working right. The cold had seeped too deep. He needed help. Now. With no other options, he made his way back toward the concert hall. Not the main entrance where the guard had kicked him out, but the side entrance where catering trucks had been unloading earlier. Maybe there was a hallway, a kitchen somewhere he could warm up without being seen. The side door was unlocked. James slipped inside and found himself in a narrow corridor lined with racks of folding chairs and stacked boxes. Heat poured from vents overhead. It felt like heaven. He sank down against the wall, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to conserve body heat. Just a few minutes, he told himself. Just long enough to stop shivering. Then he'd leave before anyone found him. But the warmth made him drowsy. His eyelids grew heavy. When was the last time he'd really slept? Days, maybe. You don't sleep much on the streets. You stay alert, always watching, always ready to move. But here in the warmth and quiet, his body demanded rest. James's eyes closed. His head drooped forward. In his mind, he was 16 again, sitting at his mother's old upright piano in their cramped apartment. His mother stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders, as he played through his Juilliard audition piece. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, supposedly doing homework, but really just listening with stars in her eyes. "You're going to be famous," Sarah had said. "I'm going to tell everyone that James Crawford is my brother." And their mother had smiled that tired smile she wore after double shifts at the hospital where she worked as a janitor. "You're already famous to us, sweetheart. Grammy-winning famous, or playing in a little bar somewhere, doesn't matter. You make beauty in the world. That's enough." James jerked awake to the sound of footsteps. A young woman in a catering uniform stood over him, eyes wide with alarm. "Sir, you can't be here. This is a restricted area." James scrambled to his feet, nearly falling in his haste. "I'm sorry. I needed to get out of the rain. I'm leaving." But the woman had already pulled out her phone. "I need to call security. Please don't." James heard the desperation in his own voice and hated it. "Please, I'm a veteran. I was just trying to get warm. I wasn't going to take anything or hurt anyone. Please." The woman hesitated, her finger hovering over her phone. Before she could decide, another door opened, and Robert Sterling himself walked through, following a staff member who was giving him a tour of the building's backstage areas. Sterling had specifically asked to see where his precious piano had been stored and prepared for the evening. "What's going on here?" Sterling demanded. His eyes took in James's disheveled appearance, the puddle of water spreading beneath him, the desperation written across his face. Sterling's expression shifted from confusion to disgust. "Who is this?" "How did he get in here? He just wandered in," the catering worker said quickly. "I was about to call security." Sterling stepped closer, his nose wrinkling. "You're one of them, aren't you?" "A veteran." He said the word like it tasted bad. "Let me guess. You saw the gala, saw all the rich people, and thought you'd help yourself to our charity." "No," James said quietly. "I just needed to get warm." "Warm?" Sterling laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you have any idea what this event costs? The security, the insurance, the venue. All so we can raise money for people like you, and you repay us by sneaking in like a thief." "I wasn't stealing anything." "No, so those silver serving trays in the kitchen wouldn't have caught your eye. The purses and coats in the coat check." James's hands clenched at his sides. "I'm not a thief." Sterling moved even closer, and James could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You know what your problem is. You think the world owes you something. You think because you put on a uniform we're all supposed to bow down and give you whatever you want. Well, newsflash, friend. Nobody forced you to join the military. You made your choices. Live with them." Something in James shifted. He'd spent 5 years invisible. 5 years accepting every insult and indignity as no more than he deserved. But this man, this privileged, arrogant man who'd never sacrificed anything in his life, standing there in his $1,000 suit, reeking of expensive champagne, lecturing him about choices. "I made my choices," James said, his voice low and steady. "I chose to serve my country." "What have you ever chosen besides which offshore account to hide your money?" In Sterling's face flushed red. "How dare you? Do you know who I am? I know exactly who you are. You're a man who thinks money makes him better than everyone else. You stand in there talking about excellence and standards, but you wouldn't recognize real talent if it punched you in the face. Is that so?" Sterling's eyes glittered with malice. "And I suppose you're the expert on talent. What's your great skill panhandling, finding the warmest grates to sleep on?" James should have walked away. Every survival instinct screamed at him to back down, apologize, leave before this got worse. But something in him snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was seeing Sarah and being reminded of who he used to be. Maybe it was 5 years of swallowing his pride finally coming up like bile. "Piano," James said. "I play piano." The words hung in the air. Sterling stared at him, then burst out laughing. The catering worker looked uncomfortable. Other staff members had appeared in doorways drawn by the commotion. You play piano?" Sterling could barely get the words out through his laughter. "Oh, this is rich." "What do you play chopsticks?" "Rachmaninoff," James said quietly. "Piano Concerto No. 2. Sterling's laughter died. He studied James with new interest, like a cat studying a particularly entertaining mouse. "You're serious? You actually expect me to believe that you, a homeless man with hands that look like they've been through a meat grinder, can play Rachmaninoff?" James said nothing. He'd already said too much. What was he thinking? Even if by some miracle Sterling let him near that piano, James hadn't played a real instrument in years. His hands barely worked on good days. The cold had stiffened them further. He'd embarrass himself, prove Sterling right, and confirm what he already knew deep down, that the pianist he'd been was dead, destroyed in the same explosion that had nearly killed him. "You know what Sterling said?" A cruel smile spreading across his face. "I'm feeling generous tonight. It is a charity event after all. Let's make this interesting. If you can play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 on my Steinway, if you can play even the first movement competently, I'll give you $10,000 cash right now." Murmurs rippled through the staff members watching. Someone whispered that this was wrong, that Sterling was being cruel. But Sterling ignored them, his eyes fixed on James. $10,000, Sterling repeated. "That's a lot of money for a man in your position. Could get you off the streets, get you cleaned up, maybe even get you some help for whatever problems led you here. All you have to do is play." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that only James could hear. "But when you fail, when you sit down at that piano and prove you're just another con artist who thought he could scam the rich people, I'm going to have you arrested for trespassing and attempted fraud. You'll spend the night in jail, maybe longer. And everyone in that room will see exactly what you are." James's scarred hands trembled, but not from the cold anymore. He stared at those hands, the right one, with its shiny burn scars and stiff fingers, the left one that ached constantly, both of them shaking with a tremor he could never quite control. Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2, the piece he'd performed for his final recital before Juilliard. The piece his mother had loved most. The piece he'd played in his dreams 1,000 times, while lying on cold sidewalks, the phantom keys beneath his fingers, the only thing that kept him sane. He couldn't play it. His hands were ruined. Sterling knew that. Everyone knew that. This wasn't a genuine offer. It was a public humiliation designed to put him in his place, to prove that men like James didn't belong in worlds like this. James should say no. He should apologize and leave. He should preserve what little dignity he had left. But then he heard his mother's voice, as clear as if she were standing beside him. "You make beauty in the world, James. That's enough. That's always enough." And he thought of Sarah, still searching for him after all these years, still believing her brother was worth finding. And he thought of every night on the streets when he'd played imaginary concerts on imaginary pianos, keeping his fingers moving through the pain, maintaining the muscle memory because some stubborn part of him refused to believe it was over. James looked up and met Sterling's eyes. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." For a moment, Sterling looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected James to actually accept. Then the cruel smile returned. "Excellent. This should be entertaining." He turned to the staff members watching. "Spread the word. We're having an impromptu performance. Everyone back to the main hall in 5 minutes." As Sterling strode away, already pulling out his phone to call his friends and make sure they didn't miss the show, James stood alone in the corridor. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. What had he done? This wasn't brave. It was suicide. He was about to humiliate himself in front of hundreds of people, one of whom was his sister. Sarah would be in that audience. She'd see him fail. She'd finally know what had happened to her brother, and the knowledge would destroy the image she'd held onto for 5 years. James turned toward the exit. He could still run. Sterling might call the police, but James knew how to disappear. He'd been doing it for years. But his feet didn't move. Something kept him rooted to that spot. A memory surfaced, pushing through the fear and shame. He was 19 years old, home on leave before his deployment to Afghanistan. He'd tried to visit his mother at the hospital where she worked, wanting to surprise her. But when he arrived, he found her sitting alone in the parking lot during her break, crying. "Mom, what's wrong?" She'd wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed to be caught. "Nothing, sweetheart, just tired." But James had pressed, and finally she'd admitted the truth. She was sick, had been for months, cancer. She hadn't told him or Sarah because she didn't want to worry them, didn't want to distract James from his training, didn't want to burden Sarah, who was working 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school. "How bad is it?" James had asked. "Treatable. Expensive, but treatable." She'd smiled that tired smile. "Don't worry about me. You focus on staying safe over there. That's all that matters." But James had worried. The treatment costs were astronomical, more than their small insurance policy would cover. Sarah was already drowning in student loans. If their mother went into debt for treatment, she'd never climb out. She'd work herself to death trying to pay it off. So James had made a decision. The Army offered signing bonuses for extended deployments hazard pay for the most dangerous assignments. If he volunteered for the hardest posts, took the missions others avoided, he could make enough to cover his mother's treatment and Sarah's loans. He could save his family. He'd told his mother he was volunteering for an extended tour because he believed in the mission, because he wanted to serve. She'd begged him not to go, pleaded with him to come home after his minimum service. But James had insisted. He'd been so sure he was doing the right thing. 2 months into his deployment, his mother had died. The cancer had spread faster than anyone expected. She'd held on long enough to get his last letter, the one where he'd enclosed a check for $10,000, his signing bonus. Sarah had read it to her in the hospital. James never got to say goodbye. He'd been on a mission when she died, unable even to call. By the time he made it home for the funeral, she'd been in the ground for a week. And 6 months later, the IED explosion that should have killed him, but instead just maimed him badly enough that he'd never play piano again. Or so the doctors said. James had believed them. He'd let that diagnosis define him. He'd let his injury become his identity. And somewhere in the spiral of pain and medication and PTSD, he'd convinced himself he had nothing left to offer the world. No talent, no purpose, no reason for anyone to care whether he lived or died. He'd cut himself off from Sarah because he couldn't bear to let her see what he'd become. The brother she remembered was dead, and this broken creature wearing his face was a poor replacement. Better she remember the prodigy than know the truth. But standing here now about to face the humiliation Sterling had planned for him, James realized something. His mother hadn't wanted him to be famous. She'd just wanted him to make beauty in the world. And for 5 years he'd stopped trying. He'd convinced himself that if he couldn't make beauty perfectly with virtuoso skill and flawless technique, then there was no point in making it at all. He'd let Sterling's definition of excellence, that rigid hierarchy of worth, become his own definition. But his mother had known better. She'd worked 2 jobs and raised 2 kids, and still found time to sing while she cooked dinner. She'd made beauty in small ways, in everyday ways, in ways that didn't require a concert hall or a $1 million piano. She'd made beauty in the world simply by being kind, by loving her children, by refusing to let hardship kill her joy. James thought of all the nights on the street when he'd kept his fingers moving, playing invisible pianos. He'd thought he was just preserving a useless skill, clinging to a dead dream. But maybe he'd been doing something else. Maybe he'd been making beauty in the only way he could, keeping a small flame alive in the darkness. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it had always been enough. James took a deep breath and walked toward the main hall. The corridor opened into the backstage area. He could hear the murmur of the crowd beyond the curtains. Sterling had made good on his promise. The entire gala had assembled to watch the show. A staff member appeared and gestured nervously toward the stage. "Mr. Sterling says to bring you out whenever you're ready. He's making the announcement now." Through a gap in the curtains, James could see Sterling at a microphone, his face flushed with excitement and champagne. The man was enjoying this, savoring the anticipation of James's humiliation like a fine wine. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling's amplified voice boomed across the hall. "We have a special treat tonight. A gentleman has volunteered to demonstrate his musical talents on our beautiful Steinway. Please welcome our surprise performer." The applause that followed was polite but confused. This wasn't on the program. What was Sterling up to? James stepped onto the stage, and the applause died. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. They saw his torn clothing, his scarred hands, his weathered face. They saw exactly what Sterling intended them to see: a homeless man out of place and outmatched. In the third row, Sarah Crawford felt her heart stop. That silhouette, those shoulders, the way he held his head slightly tilted, as if listening to music no one else could hear. It was impossible. It couldn't be. James. She stood without realizing it, her hand going to her mouth. Other people turned to look at her, but she didn't notice. Every cell in her body screamed that this was him, her brother, her James, who'd been missing for 5 years. But he was supposed to be playing piano. James was a pianist. That was the one thing everyone knew about him. On stage, Sterling smirked into the microphone. "Our volunteer has promised to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Let's see if he can deliver." He stepped back with an exaggerated bow, gesturing toward the Steinway. James walked to the piano on legs that felt like water. The bench seemed miles away. When he finally reached it and sat down, the familiarity of the position hit him like a wave. How many thousands of hours had he spent exactly like this? How many performances? How many practice sessions? How many late nights lost in the music? He looked at his hands hovering over the keys. In the bright stage lights, every scar was visible, every twisted finger, every sign of damage. His hands looked like broken things, not instruments of beauty. The audience waited. Sterling waited, already tasting victory. Sarah waited, tears streaming down her face, praying she was wrong. Praying this wasn't James, because if it was, if her brother had been on the streets all this time and never came home, never asked for help, it would break her heart into pieces too small to ever put back together. James thought of his mother one last time. "You make beauty in the world. That's enough." He placed his hands on the keys. But before James could play, Sterling's voice cut through the silence. "Wait." The billionaire walked back to the microphone, a new thought clearly having occurred to him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I should explain the stakes of this performance. If our friend here can actually play this piece, I've promised him $10,000. But I think we should make this more interesting." Sterling turned to James. "If you fail, if you can't play, you agree to leave here and never come back. You agree to stop panhandling outside establishments like this one, trading on sympathy for veterans to guilt good people into giving you money. You get help, real help, or you move on to another city. Deal." The crowd stirred uncomfortably. This had gone too far. Several people called out objections, but Sterling raised his hand for silence. "I'm offering this man $10,000. That's more than fair. I'm simply asking for accountability in return." He looked at James expectantly. James could have argued, could have pointed out that he'd never asked for Sterling's money, that this whole thing was Sterling's idea, that the billionaire was trying to publicly humiliate him, whether he played well or poorly. But what was the point? Men like Sterling always won these games. They made the rules. They held all the cards. "Okay," James said quietly. "Deal." "Excellent." Sterling returned to his seat in the front row where his friends patted him on the back and refilled his champagne glass. The audience settled back some, looking excited, others distinctly uncomfortable with the spectacle they were about to witness. Sarah hadn't moved. She stood frozen in the third row, staring at the man on stage. The longer she looked, the more certain she became. That was James, her brother. Her brilliant, kind, talented brother who'd enlisted to help their family and disappeared into the streets rather than come home. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him, to ask him why. Why hadn't he called? Why hadn't he let her help? Didn't he know she'd been searching for 5 years? Didn't he know she'd never stopped believing he was alive? But something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was the expression on his face, the way he stared at the piano keys with a mixture of longing and terror. Maybe it was the understanding that this moment was bigger than her need for reunion. This was about James and whatever demons had driven him to the streets. This was his moment, not hers. So Sarah sat back down, her hands clutched together so tightly her knuckles turned white, and waited. On stage, James took a deep breath. His hands were shaking badly now. The right hand especially looked like it was vibrating the scar tissue, pulling tight as his fingers tried to position themselves properly. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 is not an easy piece. It's not even a difficult piece. It's a brutal piece, a punishing piece, a piece that demands strength and stamina and absolute technical precision. The opening requires the pianist to play massive, thundering chords that span more than an octave, hands moving in coordinated strikes that sound like orchestral bells. Even healthy, undamaged hands struggled with it. Scarred hands that had been told they'd never play again had no business attempting it. James knew this. He'd known it when he accepted Sterling's challenge. This wasn't about proving he could still play at a professional level. That ship had sailed. His hands would never regain their former agility. He'd lost too much range of motion, too much fine motor control. But maybe he could play well enough to prove Sterling wrong. Maybe he could show that broken things still had value, that scars didn't erase what came before them. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the last time he'd played this piece. His Juilliard showcase 6 months before he enlisted. The recital hall had been packed, scouts from symphonies and concert halls taking notes, his mother and Sarah beaming from the front row. He remembered walking onto that stage feeling invincible, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd nailed every practice session, that his interpretation was flawless, that nothing could go wrong. That was the confidence of youth, of talent that had never been truly tested. This was different. James had no illusions about his ability. He knew his limitations intimately. He knew exactly how many keys he could no longer reach, how many passages would be impossible. how much pain each chord would cause. But he also knew something now that the 19-year-old prodigy hadn't. He knew that perfection wasn't the point. The music wasn't about him. It wasn't about impressing judges or winning scholarships or proving his worth. The music existed for itself, and all he had to do was serve it as best he could. James opened his eyes and looked out at the audience. 300 faces stared back at him, waiting. Most looked skeptical. Some looked pitying. A few looked outright hostile, as if his presence on stage was an insult to real musicians everywhere. His gaze found Sarah. She was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears. Their eyes met across the distance of the concert hall, and in that moment James saw everything he'd been running from. Her love, her grief, her desperate, enduring hope that had survived 5 years of silence. He also saw their mother. Not literally, but in the way Sarah held herself, the tilt of her head, the expression of fierce pride mixed with concern. Sarah had inherited their mother's strength, her refusal to give up on the people she loved. James hadn't come home because he'd convinced himself he had nothing to offer, that his family deserved better than a broken veteran who couldn't even take care of himself. But looking at Sarah now, he understood what a fool he'd been. She'd never cared about his talent or his success. She'd just wanted her brother back. Scars and all, broken and all, homeless and all. He'd robbed her of 5 years they could have had together. He'd robbed himself of the chance to heal, surrounded by people who loved him. And for what pride, shame. The fear that he wasn't good enough anymore. No more, James thought. Whatever happens with this performance, whether I succeed or fail, I'm going home with Sarah tonight. I'm done running. The decision settled over him like a weight lifting. Suddenly, the piano in front of him wasn't a test or a trap. It was just an instrument, beautiful and waiting. The notes existed whether he played them perfectly or poorly. The music would survive his mistakes. James placed his hands on the keys one more time. The ivory felt smooth and cool beneath his scarred fingers. He took one final breath, held it, and began to play. The first note was wrong. Not wildly wrong, just slightly off a minor chord played with too much force. The timing a fraction of a second too soon. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Several people in the audience winced. Sterling's face split into a triumphant grin. He leaned toward his companion and whispered something that made them both laugh. On stage, James's hands trembled over the keys. His right hand had spasmed on that first strike, the damaged muscles not responding the way his brain commanded. He could feel sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the cool air. This was a disaster. He should stop now, admit defeat before he embarrassed himself further. But then he heard his mother's voice again. "One wrong note doesn't ruin a song, James. Keep going. The music is bigger than your mistakes." She'd told him that when he was 7 years old, crying over a missed note in his first recital. He'd wanted to run off stage, convinced he'd ruined everything. But she'd been waiting in the wings, and she'd knelt down and taken his small hands in hers and told him the truth that every real musician eventually learns. Perfection isn't the goal. Truth is the goal. Feeling is the goal. Connection is the goal. James played the second note. This one was better. Still not perfect, his hand shaking through the keystroke, but closer. The sound wasn't quite what he wanted, but it was in the right direction. The third note rang out clear and strong. His left hand joined in, adding the bass line, and suddenly the shape of the music began to emerge from the chaos of individual notes. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto builds slowly, almost reluctantly, like someone waking from a deep sleep. It's meant to sound haunting, uncertain, searching for something just beyond reach. The composer wrote it while recovering from a depression so severe he'd considered never writing music again. Every note carries that weight, that sense of struggling through darkness toward light. James had understood the piece intellectually before, but now he understood it in his bones. He knew what it meant to be broken and unsure if healing was possible. He knew what it felt like to have something precious stolen by trauma. He knew the exhausting, painful work of trying to rebuild yourself one small piece at a time. His hands moved across the keys, not with the fluid virtuosity of his youth, but with something else, something harder earned. His fingers stumbled over passages that used to be effortless. His right hand cramped on the wider intervals, unable to stretch the way it once had. Several times he had to adjust his fingering on the fly, finding alternative ways to play sections that his damaged hands simply couldn't execute as written. But he kept going, and slowly something miraculous began to happen. The audience stopped fidgeting. The whispers died away. Even Sterling's smirk faded, replaced by confusion, and then something that might have been wonder. Because despite the technical imperfections, despite the missed notes and awkward fingerings, despite hands that visibly shook with effort, James was making music. Real music. The kind that reaches into your chest and squeezes your heart. The kind that makes you forget to breathe. He reached the first major chord progression, the moment where the piece explodes from tentative exploration into full orchestral richness. On a perfect day with perfect hands, James used to make these chords ring out like thunder, filling the entire hall with sound. Now, with his scarred hands and limited range, he couldn't quite reach that power. The chords came out thinner, more fragile. But somehow that fragility made them more poignant. Instead of thunder, they sounded like hope. Tentative, uncertain hope that refuses to die no matter how much darkness tries to smother it. In the audience, a woman in the fifth row found herself crying without knowing why. A man in the back, who'd come to the gala only because his wife made him felt something crack open inside his chest. A teenage volunteer who'd been checking her phone looked up and couldn't look away. And Sarah Crawford sat with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face, watching her brother do what he was born to do. Not perfectly, but honestly, completely, with every ounce of his battered soul poured into the music. The piece moved into its second theme, a melody that starts simple and builds into something achingly beautiful. This was the section their mother had loved most. She used to hum it while washing dishes, her voice carrying through their tiny apartment. James's hands found the melody, and something shifted in his playing. The technical struggle fell away. He stopped thinking about his limitations and simply played trusting muscle memory that went deeper than conscious thought, deeper than pain, deeper than anything the war had taken from him. The scarred right hand that doctors said would never function properly moved across the high keys with surprising delicacy. The left hand provided the foundation strong and steady despite its own damage. Together they wove the melody that had soundtracked his childhood, his mother's favorite song. Sarah recognized it immediately. She'd heard James play this section 100 times, but never like this. Before, his playing had been technically brilliant, but emotionally reserved, the work of a prodigy who'd mastered the notes but hadn't yet lived enough to understand their meaning. This was different. This playing came from somewhere deep and wounded and real. Every note carried the weight of 5 years on the streets. Every phrase spoke of loss and regret and stubborn, irrational hope. This wasn't a performance. It was a confession. The music built toward the climax of the first movement, the point where all the themes come together in a cascade of sound that should be overwhelming. James's hands raced across the keys faster now, driven by something beyond conscious control. His right hand cramped. Pain shot up his arm like lightning. For a moment, his fingers froze, paralyzed by damaged nerves that wouldn't respond. The music faltered. A gap opened where notes should have been. In the front row, Sterling's smirk returned. There it was, the inevitable failure. The proof that this was all a farce, that broken men stayed broken, that you couldn't put shattered pieces back together and expect them to function like new. But Sterling had never been broken. He'd never had to learn what people like James knew in their bones, that you don't have to be unbroken to be valuable. You don't have to be whole to be beautiful. Sometimes the cracks are where the light gets through. James's left hand kept playing, holding the bass line steady while his right hand hung useless above the keys. The melody was incomplete, missing its crucial upper register. By all rights, he should stop. No one could play this piece one-handed. But James didn't stop. His left hand moved faster, taking on some of the melodic duty while maintaining the bass. It was impossible. The fingering required moves his left hand had never practiced intervals it wasn't designed to span. He played it anyway. Not cleanly, not correctly. But he played it pouring everything he had into that one functioning hand, making it do the work of two. And then slowly, his right hand began to move again. The cramp released. Feeling returned. His fingers found the keys, shaky and uncertain, but there. The melody returned, both hands working together again imperfectly but undeniably. The music that had faltered surged back to life, building toward its climax with renewed force. The audience was on its feet now, though no one had consciously decided to stand. They'd simply been pulled upward by the sheer force of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a piano performance. It was a man refusing to let his brokenness define him. It was 5 years of pain and isolation and shame being transformed into something transcendent. James reached the final chord of the first movement, a massive ringing declaration that requires both hands to span nearly 2 octaves. He couldn't make that reach anymore. His damaged hands simply didn't have the flexibility. So he broke the chord, playing the notes in quick succession instead of simultaneously, a technique called arpeggiation that gave the same harmonic effect with less physical demand. It wasn't how Rachmaninoff wrote it, but it was how James could play it, and in this moment, that was enough. The final note rang out across the hall, sustained by the piano's resonance long after James's hands left the keys. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The silence was absolute. James sat at the piano bench, his hands in his lap, shaking violently now from exhaustion and pain and spent adrenaline. He'd played one movement of a 3-movement concerto, maybe 12 minutes of music, and he felt like he'd run a marathon. He didn't look at the audience, didn't want to see their reactions. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd proved to himself that the music was still there, that the explosion in Afghanistan had taken his hands, but not his soul. Whether anyone else understood that didn't matter. Then the applause began. It started with one person in the back row, a slow clap that echoed through the silence. Then another joined in. And another. Within seconds, the entire hall was thundering with applause, 300 people on their feet, clapping and cheering and wiping away tears. James looked up, stunned. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd expected polite acknowledgement, at best embarrassed silence at worst. Not this, not ovation. In the third row, Sarah was already moving, pushing past people in her aisle, running toward the stage. She didn't care that it was inappropriate. didn't care that everyone was watching. That was her brother up there, her James, who she'd thought was lost forever. She reached the stage and climbed up the side steps, her elegant gown hiked up around her knees. James saw her coming and stood taking a step back, suddenly terrified. He'd been prepared for this moment with an audience of strangers, but facing Sarah, seeing the tears streaming down her face, the mix of joy and anger and relief in her eyes, that was different. "James," she said. Her voice broke on his name. "Oh God, James, is it really you?" He wanted to run. Even now, after everything, some part of him wanted to disappear rather than face what he'd done to her. 5 years. 5 years she'd been looking and he'd been hiding, too ashamed to come home. But his legs wouldn't move. He stood frozen as Sarah crossed the stage and threw her arms around him, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. "You're alive?" she sobbed into his shoulder. You're alive, I can't believe you're alive." James's arms came up slowly, hesitantly, and wrapped around his sister. She was taller than he remembered. Stronger. The little girl who used to braid his hair before recitals had grown into a woman who'd spent 5 years refusing to give up hope. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I should have come home. I should have called. I'm sorry. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Where have you been? What happened? Why didn't you come to me? I couldn't." The words came hard, pulled from somewhere deep. "I couldn't let you see me like this. You deserved better than what I became. Better than what." Sarah's voice rose, anger bleeding through the tears. "Better than my brother James I've been searching for 5 years. I've called every hospital, every shelter, every VA office in 3 states. I've walked through neighborhoods at night showing your picture to strangers. I've never given up, not for one single day, and you think I deserved better than you." The accusation hit harder than any bomb. James had convinced himself he was protecting Sarah by staying away, that he was sparing her the burden of his broken self. But he'd never considered what his disappearance had done to her. The years of uncertainty, the endless searching, the grief of not knowing if her brother was alive or dead. "I was ashamed," he said simply. "I lost everything. My hands, my career, my ability to take care of myself. I didn't want you to see me begging on street corners or sleeping in shelters. I didn't want to be your burden. You were never a burden." Sarah's voice was fierce now. "You were my brother. You were the person who taught me to tie my shoes and helped me with my homework, and enlisted in the army so I could finish nursing school without debt. You think any of that goes away because you got hurt?" James had no answer for that. He'd spent so long defining himself by his injuries, by what he'd lost, that he'd forgotten about what remained. The love didn't go away just because the talent did. The family didn't dissolve just because he couldn't support them financially. The audience watched this reunion with a mixture of respect and discomfort, unsure whether they should stay or go, whether this private moment should be witnessed by hundreds of strangers. But no one moved. They were transfixed by the raw emotion on display, by the years of pain and love spilling out on stage. In the front row, Robert Sterling stood very still. His champagne glass hung forgotten in his hand. His face had gone pale beneath its artificial tan. He'd come to this gala feeling magnanimous, the generous benefactor bestowing charity on the less fortunate. He'd thrown out his challenge to James, expecting to prove a point about the natural hierarchy of the world, about how some people were simply born to succeed while others weren't. But watching this broken man play music that shouldn't have been possible, watching him pour his soul into an instrument with hands that had every excuse to fail, watching his sister's joyful grief at finding her lost brother Sterling was being forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He'd been wrong. About everything. James Crawford wasn't some scam artist trying to exploit sympathy. He was a genuinely talented musician whose career had been derailed by service to his country. He wasn't lazy or looking for handouts. He was a man so overwhelmed by trauma and shame that he'd chosen streets over the pity he imagined he'd see in his family's eyes. And Sterling's cruel challenge designed to humiliate had instead become the catalyst for the most powerful performance this concert hall had ever witnessed. Not in spite of James's broken hands, but because of them. The scars, the struggle, the pain, all of it had added depth to the music that perfect technique could never achieve. Sterling thought about his speech earlier about excellence and standards, and how some things should be reserved for those who'd proven themselves worthy. He'd been talking about money and status, about the kind of worth that could be measured in dollars and degrees. But James had just demonstrated a different kind of worth. The worth that comes from perseverance, from refusing to let circumstances destroy what matters most, from getting back up no matter how many times you get knocked down. Sterling had never been knocked down in his life. He'd been born to wealth and multiplied it, but he'd never faced real hardship. He'd never had to rebuild himself from nothing. He'd inherited his worth rather than earning it. Who was really worthy? The man born with every advantage, or the man who'd lost everything and kept going anyway? The question made Sterling deeply uncomfortable. His entire worldview was built on the belief that success proved virtue, that those with money and power deserved it by virtue of their superiority. James's existence challenged that belief at its foundation. On stage, Sarah had finally pulled back from hugging James, though she kept one hand on his arm as if afraid he might disappear if she let go completely. She was looking at him with a mixture of joy and devastation, taking in his appearance for the first time. The weight he'd lost, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face, the way his clothes hung on his frame. "We're getting you home," she said firmly. "Tonight. Right now. You're coming home with me, and we're going to figure this out together like we should have done 5 years ago." James nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. Home. The word felt foreign and wonderful at the same time. But before they could move, Sterling climbed onto the stage. The movement was awkward, undignified. He'd had too much champagne and wasn't accustomed to physical exertion. But he made it up and stood facing James, his expression unreadable. The hall fell silent again, waiting to see what would happen next. Some audience members looked nervous. Sterling didn't have a reputation for gracious acceptance of being proven wrong. Sterling opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. The words clearly didn't come easily. "What I did tonight was cruel and unfair. I treated you as less than human because of your circumstances, and I was wrong to do so." James stared at him, not sure what to say. An apology was the last thing he'd expected. "You played beautifully," Sterling continued. "Not perfectly, I'm sure you know that. But perfectly isn't the point, is it?" He gave a self-deprecating smile. "I've spent my whole life chasing perfection. Perfect portfolio, perfect collection, perfect reputation. I thought that was what mattered. That standards and excellence were everything." He looked down at his hands, smooth and unmarked and useless when it came to creating anything of real value. "But watching you tonight, I realized I don't actually know what excellence means. I've been confusing it with ease, with natural talent, with things that come without cost. But real excellence, the kind that matters, comes from pushing through difficulty, from creating beauty despite obstacles, not in absence of them." Sterling reached into his jacket and pulled out a money clip thick with cash. He counted out $10,000 and held it toward James. "You earned this, fair and square. I know it can't make up for what I said or how I treated you, but it's yours. James looked at the money for a long moment. $10,000 could change his life, could get him off the streets into treatment, give him a foundation to rebuild. But taking it would mean accepting the premise of Sterling's original challenge. It would mean validating the idea that his worth could be measured in his ability to perform on command for a rich man's entertainment. "Keep it," James said quietly. "Use it for other veterans. There are thousands of people who came home from war and couldn't put their lives back together. They need help more than I do. I have my sister. That makes me rich." Sarah squeezed his arm, a fresh wave of tears streaming down her face. Sterling stood holding the rejected money, looking more lost than he had all night. Then slowly, he nodded. "You're right. I'll add it to the foundation's total tonight. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to establish a scholarship program for veterans with artistic talent who need support rebuilding their careers. We could call it the Crawford Scholarship, if you'd permit that." James was too stunned to immediately respond. Sarah answered for him. "That would be wonderful." She looked at her brother. "It would help people like you, people who deserve a second chance." "Not a second chance," James said softly. "Just a chance to keep going despite everything. We don't need to redo what we lost. We just need support to build something new from where we are." Sterling nodded again, and this time when he held out his hand, it wasn't offering money, but asking for a handshake, a gesture of respect between equals. James hesitated, then took it, his scarred hand engulfing Sterling's perfectly manicured one. The audience burst into applause, again sensing that something important had happened, some transformation that went beyond the music. A few people openly wept. Many more looked thoughtful, as if reconsidering their own assumptions about worth and dignity, and who deserves compassion. Sarah tugged gently on James's arm. "Let's go home," she said. "You can sleep in a real bed tonight. We'll figure out everything else tomorrow." James nodded and let her lead him toward the stage exit. But he paused at the edge, looking back at the Steinway grand piano that sat in the spotlight waiting. "Thank you," he said to the instrument, though he meant it for more than just the piano, for the music that had never left him even when everything else did, for the memory of his mother that had guided him through the darkest moments, for the sister who'd never stopped searching, for the stubborn, irrational hope that kept him alive when dying would have been easier. The piano gleamed silently under the lights, ready for the next person brave enough to try. As James and Sarah left the stage, the gala erupted into conversation. Everyone wanted to talk about what they'd just witnessed to process the emotional whiplash of the last hour. The string quartet that had been scheduled to play next packed up their instruments without complaint, understanding that nothing they could perform would match the moment they'd just experienced. Sterling stood alone at the microphone, still processing his own transformation. He'd come to this event the same way he came to every social function, as the most important person in the room, secure in his superiority, comfortable in his power. Now he felt small and uncertain, like a child who'd just discovered the world was far more complex than he'd been taught. He lifted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention once more." The crowd quieted, curious about what else this extraordinary evening could possibly hold. Tonight was supposed to be about charity, about helping those who served our country. But I realize now that I've been thinking about charity all wrong. Sterling paused, gathering his thoughts. Charity isn't about rich people bestowing gifts on the less fortunate. It's not about feeling good because we wrote a check or threw a gala. Real charity is about recognizing the inherent dignity in every human being. It's about understanding that circumstances don't define worth, that a man sleeping on the street has the same fundamental value as a man sleeping in a penthouse. He looked toward the exit where James and Sarah had disappeared. "I treated that man as lesser because he was homeless. I mocked him, set him up to fail, used his desperation for my entertainment. And in doing so, I proved that wealth and education don't make you superior. They just make you comfortable. And comfort can make you cruel. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Many of them recognized themselves in Sterling's confession. How many times had they walked past homeless veterans without a second glance? How many times had they assumed that people living on the streets had somehow earned their fate through bad choices or moral failings? Sterling continued, "I'm going to do more than establish a scholarship tonight. I'm committing $1 million to housing and mental health services for homeless veterans in Chicago. Not as charity in the old sense, but as a recognition that we owe these men and women more than our gratitude. We owe them concrete support to rebuild their lives." The applause that greeted this announcement was different from the earlier ovations. This was relief, a collective exhaling of tension. Sterling had given voice to the discomfort many in the room were feeling, and his commitment to action provided a path forward. But even as people clapped, some felt it wasn't enough. $1 million was a lot of money, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the need. Thousands of veterans lived on Chicago's streets. How many more James Crawfords were out there hiding in plain sight, too ashamed or traumatized to ask for help? A woman near the front stood up. She was in her 60s, elegantly dressed. Her gray hair swept into a sophisticated updo. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she sat on the boards of half a dozen charitable foundations. "I'd like to match Robert's commitment," she announced. $1 million to the same cause. Someone else stood. "I can contribute $200,000. Another voice. $500,000 here." One by one, Chicago's elite opened their wallets in a way they rarely did, moved by what they'd witnessed, to actually do something rather than just feel something. By the time the pledges stopped, over $4 million had been committed to services for homeless veterans. Sterling stood at the microphone with tears in his eyes, humbled by the outpouring. "This is what James Crawford did tonight," he said. "He didn't just play piano. He reminded us of our humanity. He showed us that the distance between his situation and ours is smaller than we like to think. Any of us, given the right circumstances, the right traumas, the right series of unfortunate events, could end up where he was." In the lobby, Sarah was trying to get James into her car, but he kept stopping, overwhelmed by everything. The warmth of the heated building after years of cold. The sound of his sister's voice after years of silence. The reality that he'd just played piano in front of hundreds of people, despite believing he'd never touch an instrument again. He sank onto a bench, his hands shaking so violently he had to press them together to make them stop. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was draining away, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and pain. His hands felt like they were on fire. Every joint ached. The scar tissue pulled tight across his knuckles. Sarah sat beside him and gently took his hands in hers, examining them with a nurse's practiced eye. "You need to see a doctor. These look like they've never been properly treated." "I was at the VA for a while after I got back," James said, "but I stopped going. The medications made me feel disconnected, like I was floating outside my body, and the therapists kept wanting me to talk about the war, about what happened, and I just couldn't." Sarah nodded. "We'll find you better help. Doctors who understand trauma, therapists who won't push you before you're ready." She looked up at him. "But James, you have to promise me you won't disappear again. No matter how hard it gets, no matter how much you want to run, you have to stay. You have to let me help. I promise." The words came easier than James expected. Something had shifted during the performance. The shame that had driven him into isolation for 5 years had loosened its grip. He wasn't cured, wasn't suddenly whole again. But he'd proved to himself that his brokenness wasn't the end of his story. Sarah's car was a modest Honda Practical and well-maintained. She helped James into the passenger seat and cranked up the heat, then sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel, not starting the engine. "I thought about this moment so many times," she said quietly. "What I'd say when I found you. I had whole speeches planned. But now that you're here, I don't know what to say except that I love you and I'm so glad you're alive. I love you too, Sarah." James looked at his little sister, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. She'd become so strong, so capable. She didn't need him to take care of her anymore. Maybe she never really had. Maybe the person who'd needed saving all along was him, and he'd been too proud or too ashamed to admit it. Sarah started the car and pulled into Chicago traffic. The streets were wet from earlier rain, reflecting the neon signs and streetlights in pools of color. James watched the city slide past the window, seeing it with fresh eyes. He'd walked these streets for 5 years, as an invisible ghost, trying not to be noticed, trying not to exist. Now he was seeing them as a person again. Someone with a name and a history, and people who cared whether he lived or died. The city looked different when you knew you belonged in it. Sarah's apartment was in a modest neighborhood on the north side, a one-bedroom place she'd stretched her budget to afford. She'd kept it small, deliberately saving money in case James needed it, in case he finally came home and needed support to get back on his feet. She showed him the bathroom and set out clean towels and soap. "Take your time," she said. "I'll make up the couch for you." But when James closed the bathroom door and saw himself in the mirror, he stopped. He'd avoided mirrors for years, unable to face what he'd become. Now he forced himself to look. The man staring back was gaunt and weathered, his beard scraggly, his hair long and unkempt. The scar that ran from his right temple down to his jaw stood out livid against his pale skin. His clothes hung on his frame, tattered and stained beyond any hope of recovery. But his eyes weren't empty anymore. For 5 years they'd been dead, the eyes of someone just going through the motions of survival without any real hope or purpose. Now there was something in them again. Not happiness exactly, not peace, but possibility. The faint glimmer of believing that tomorrow might be better than today. James turned on the shower and let it run hot, filling the small bathroom with steam. He stepped under the water and felt 5 years of accumulated dirt and shame begin to wash away. It ran brown and gray down the drain, carrying with it layers of sleeping rough and eating from dumpsters and hiding from everyone who'd ever known him. The water couldn't wash away his scars, or heal his damaged hands, or erase the memories of Afghanistan that still woke him screaming in the night. But it was a start, a first step. And James had learned that sometimes that's all you can do. Take the next step, then the one after that, and trust that eventually all those small steps will carry you somewhere worth going. 6 months later, James stood in the wings of a small community theater on Chicago's South Side, listening to a dozen children murder Beethoven with cheerful enthusiasm. Their timing was off. Their notes were occasionally painful, and at least 3 of them were playing entirely different songs. It was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. This was his life now. 3 days a week, he taught piano to kids at a community center that served low-income families. Most of his students had never touched an instrument before their first lesson. Some came from homes where music was a luxury no one could afford. Others were refugees learning English as a second language, finding that musical notation was easier to read than words. James loved every frustrating, chaotic minute of it. His hands still didn't work the way they used to. He'd spent months in physical therapy rebuilding strength and flexibility, one painful exercise at a time. He'd gained back some range of motion, but would never recover it all. There were pieces he couldn't play anymore, techniques that remained beyond his damaged fingers' reach. But he'd learned to adapt. He'd developed new fingerings for difficult passages, found creative ways around his physical limitations. And in teaching children, he'd discovered that you didn't need perfect technique to make music meaningful. You just needed honesty and effort, and the willingness to keep trying despite mistakes. The recital ended, and the children took their bows to enthusiastic applause from parents armed with cameras and smartphones. James watched from the wings as one of his students, a 9-year-old girl named Maya, who'd started lessons unable to read music, played a simple melody she'd learned by heart. Her tongue stuck out in concentration, her fingers carefully finding each note. When she finished and the audience clapped, her face lit up with pride. That's why he taught. For moments like that, for the chance to show kids that they could create something beautiful, that their hands and hearts and minds were capable of more than they imagined. After the recital, Sarah appeared with 2 cups of coffee from the cafe across the street. She'd made every one of James's recitals just like their mother used to. "You're crying again," she observed, handing him a coffee. "Happy tears," James said, wiping his eyes. "Maya nailed that Bach minuet. 6 months ago, she couldn't even find middle C. You're a good teacher." Sarah smiled. "Better than you were a performer, maybe. You actually have patience now." "Suffering builds character," James replied with mock solemnity. Then more seriously, "I think I needed to lose everything to figure out what actually mattered. When I was a prodigy, music was about proving myself. Now it's about sharing something I love. That's better." They walked to Sarah's car through evening streets, busy with people heading home from work, stopping for groceries, living their ordinary lives. James had his own apartment, now a studio in a building that housed several other veterans transitioning off the streets. It wasn't much, but it was his, paid for, partly with disability benefits he'd finally applied for, and partly with his salary from teaching. The Crawford scholarship that Sterling had established helped too. James had been its first recipient, receiving funding for intensive music therapy and retraining. He'd used the money to work with a specialized teacher who'd helped him develop techniques for playing with limited hand mobility. Sterling himself had become an unlikely advocate for homeless veterans. He'd stepped down from several corporate boards to focus on his foundation work, throwing his considerable influence and resources into systemic change. He and James weren't exactly friends, but they'd developed a mutual respect. Sterling occasionally attended James's student recitals, always sitting in the back, always staying just long enough to hear 1 or 2 pieces before slipping out. Sarah dropped James at his building. "Dinner tomorrow," she reminded him. "Don't forget." "I won't." James climbed out, then leaned back through the window. Sarah. "Thanks for not giving up on me. You're my brother." She said it simply, as if there had never been any other option. "That's what family means. We don't give up." James watched her drive away, then headed inside. His apartment was on the 3rd floor, a walk-up that had been challenging at first, but now barely winded him. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost, filled out through regular meals and a stable routine. He'd never looked the way he had before the war, but he looked healthy, alive. His apartment was simply furnished: a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf, and in the corner by the window, a used upright piano that Sarah had found on Craigslist. It wasn't a Steinway. It wasn't even particularly good. The middle C stuck occasionally, and the upper octave was slightly out of tune. James loved it with a fierce devotion that surprised him. He sat down at the bench and let his hands rest on the keys, still marveling that he could do this, that he had an instrument in his home and time to play it. He didn't practice the way he used to, with brutal hours drilling technique and chasing perfection. Now he played for the joy of it. He'd work through a piece for his students, then improvise for a while, letting his hands wander where they wanted. Sometimes he played arrangements of songs his mother used to sing. Sometimes he worked on simplified versions of classics that his students might eventually learn. And sometimes on particularly good days when his hands were cooperating and the pain wasn't too bad, he'd play Rachmaninoff. Tonight was one of those nights. James placed his scarred hands on the keys and began the opening of Piano Concerto No. 2, the piece that had changed everything. He didn't play it perfectly. He never would. But he played it honestly with all the emotion and experience he'd earned through suffering. The tentative opening notes filled his small apartment, carrying with them the memory of that night at the gala, of Sterling's cruel challenge, of Sarah's tears, of 300 people, standing to applaud not his perfection, but his perseverance. As James played, he thought about all the people he'd met in the 6 months since that night. The other veterans in his building, each with their own scars and stories and slow journeys toward healing. His students at the community center, learning that making music didn't require wealth or status, just a willingness to try. The volunteers at the shelter where he'd spent so many nights, who'd treated him with dignity even when he couldn't treat himself that way. He thought about his mother, who'd never lived to see this redemption, but whose love had made it possible. She'd taught him that worth wasn't measured by success or talent, but by the choice to keep creating beauty even when the world tried to break you. And he thought about the man he'd been at 19, the prodigy, certain of his gifts and his future, who'd had no idea what life could take away or what could remain after everything seemed lost. If he could speak to that young man now, James wasn't sure what he'd say. Maybe he'd warn him about the IED that waited on a dusty road in Afghanistan. Maybe he'd tell him to come home sooner, to not let shame keep him from his family. Or maybe he wouldn't change anything, because the man he'd become, scarred and broken and slowly healing, understood things the prodigy never could. He understood that perfection was an illusion, that beauty emerged from struggle, that the most meaningful art came not from those blessed with easy talent, but from those who refused to stop creating, even when creation became hard. James finished the opening passage and let his hands fall silent. Outside his window, Chicago stretched into the night. Millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one carrying its own invisible struggles and triumphs. His hands ached. They always did after playing. Tomorrow they'd be worse, stiff and swollen, and he'd have to ice them and take medication and do the exercises his physical therapist prescribed. The pain was part of his life now. He'd accepted that. But tonight, his hands had made music. They'd taken the notes that lived in his mind and transformed them into sound that filled the air. That was enough. That was everything. James looked at his scarred hands in the lamplight, turning them over to examine the damage written across his skin. For years, these scars had been symbols of shame, proof of his brokenness, reasons to hide. Now he saw them differently. They were a map of where he'd been, evidence that he'd survived what should have destroyed him. They told a story of war and trauma, and living on the streets, but also of recovery and second chances, and the stubborn refusal to let circumstances define who you could be. Scars don't define us, James thought. What we do with them does. He stood from the piano bench and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had been his home through the darkest years, and now again in better ones. Somewhere out there, other veterans were sleeping rough tonight, fighting their own battles with trauma and shame and the systems that had failed them. James couldn't save them all. He could barely save himself some days. But he could teach a few kids to play piano. He could share his story with others who felt broken beyond repair. He could show up and keep trying, and prove that healing wasn't about becoming unbroken, but about learning to build a meaningful life around the cracks. The light from his apartment window reflected off the glass, showing James his own ghostly reflection against the backdrop of the city. He looked different than he had 6 months ago. Healthier, calmer, more present. But he still carried the scars. He always would. And that was okay. More than okay. The scars were part of his story, now woven into the fabric of who he'd become. They'd always hurt. Some days worse than others. But they didn't have to be the end of anything. They could be the middle, the turning point, the place where the story changed direction. James's reflection in the window smiled. Not a big smile. Not the confident grin of the 19-year-old prodigy who'd thought talent could shield him from the world's hardness. This was a smaller smile, harder one, built on understanding that joy and pain weren't opposites, but partners in the work of being human. Tomorrow he'd wake up, and his hands would hurt, and he'd wonder if teaching piano to kids who couldn't afford better instructors was really making a difference. He'd have moments of doubt, of remembering the concert career he'd lost, of mourning the life that could have been. But he'd also wake up in his own bed, in his own apartment, with a sister who loved him, and students who needed him, and a future that existed as more than just surviving another day on the streets. He'd make coffee, and do his physical therapy exercises and play piano, because he wanted to, not to prove anything to anyone, but simply because making music made him feel human. And on his really good days, James would look at his scarred hands and feel something close to gratitude. Not for the explosion that damaged them, not for the trauma that sent him spiraling into 5 years of homelessness, but for what came after. For the slow, painful work of putting himself back together. For learning that you could be broken and valuable at the same time. For discovering that the music was never in his hands to begin with. It was in his heart, and that was something no war could destroy. James turned from the window and looked back at his piano, his imperfect, slightly out-of-tune upright that made beauty anyway. Like recognizing the broken instrument and the broken man both still capable of creating something worth hearing. He sat back down at the bench. Not to practice or prepare for anything, but simply to play. For himself. For his mother's memory. For the man he used to be, and the man he was becoming. For anyone else out there who felt like their scars disqualified them from making beauty. His scarred hands settled on the keys one more time. And in a small apartment on Chicago's north side, a former prodigy who'd learned the hard way that talent and worth were different things entirely began to play. Making music not despite his brokenness, but through it proving that sometimes the most beautiful sounds come from instruments that have been shattered and painstakingly rebuilt. The melody drifted out through the window and into the Chicago night, carried on the same wind that had once chilled James to the bone as he slept on these streets. But tonight, the wind carried hope instead of despair, proof instead of doubt, a simple message from a man who'd lost everything and found himself anyway. Scars don't define us. What we do with them does.